The young girl watches the foreigners approaching. She is an Awa hailing from Maluta, a small tepet on the banks of the Coatzacoalcos River near the hot and humid Gulf Coast. Until now, her days have been spent as all young girls here are, helping her mother and grandmother to weave and to grind maize into tortillas for the family to eat. But now, for reasons the young girl struggles to understand, her family is sending her away with these foreigners. These foreigners are Maya, hailing from the Yucatec region of those people descended from the legendary bygone kingdoms of yesteryear. They are traders who have struck a deal, trading something for the girl, maybe outright buying her with cacao beans, textiles, or some other desired good. Whatever these men have paid for her, they did so to earn themselves a slave. Such is the fungibility of human life in this unforgiving world. She is to be taken from her home and ride with these men in their small boats to the Maya world an impossible distance away from the land she grew up in. She knows what to expect from the life of a slave. Her own family, minor nobles in their small city-state, had their own for a time. She knows that her day will be spent weaving, sweeping, and cooking, the women's work, and in that respect will differ little from the life she has already known. But the difference is that she will not work for her own family, but for her master's. She will belong entirely to him, serve his needs and the needs of his wives. She will have no name to herself, and her children, if she has any, will not belong to her. They will carry no name or legacy of their own. And it will be without end. Her days will blur together, one after another, indistinguishable, and only the growing, aging, and dying of her own body to delineate one time from another. In this recursive world of Mesoamerica, her life is chained to a very small wheel, rotating tightly around its constrained center. The men now have a brief conversation with her parents, finalizing the arrangements. She's too dazed to notice if her mother is weeping for her or not. There is rarely such sentimentality in matters like this. One of the Maya traders takes her by the arm, leading her away. She doesn't even think to turn and say goodbye to her family. She misses her opportunity and will have plenty of time to yearn for that lost moment in the years to come. But she may never see them again. Whatever happens in those final moments together must have been unsentimental and unsparing. There is no room for it in the harsh edges of the Aztec periphery. The girl's only solace is that she is young enough that the memory of this day might, in time, fade into nothingness, the void of forgotten time, unremembered and unmourned. Hello, and welcome to Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast dedicated to seeing the history of the Americas from within the visions of the people who lived it. I'm your host, Gavrilo Z. Today we are here to stress test the foundation of the Spanish myth. The myth of Spanish victory in their war with the Aztecs is attributed to many things: God, germs, the technology of the Spanish, the chivalric brilliance of Cortés, often in his own writings acting with singular superhuman ability. The conviction some hold for this myth comes from the coherence we assume it has. But that coherence only holds so long as it is not asked to bear the weight of historical evidence. A weight of evidence that points to the Spanish victory not primarily as one of steel and guns, but of language and diplomacy, and how the dismantling of the Aztec Empire was not outright Spanish victory, but instead the collaboration of the Spanish with indigenous allies, who saw an opportunity to upend the pyramid of Mexica power with the arrival of these bearded strangers. We saw this at play in last week's episode on Moctezuma, Lord of the Aztecs. The arrival of the Spanish radically altered the calculus of power in the valley, and the historical indecipherability of Moctezuma's actions became simpler to understand when decrypted by the enigma of who holds power and how they do it. He was an indigenous lord not in the thrall of cosmic panic of a white savior myth, but rather a power pragmatist who made a gamble on his ability to sway the strangers through temptation and intrigue. In our final analysis, we saw that Moctezuma was a leader who chose welcome over war, at first. But Moctezuma was negotiating a threat to his power from a top power's apex, a precarious but advantageous position. In this episode, we will look at another example of indigenous collaboration with the Spanish being key to the understanding of this war's terrible outcome, and we will instead find a figure in history whose motivations, limitations, and legacy left behind tragic consequences and birthed, in so many ways, the national psyche of modern-day Mexico. And it's in this episode we will see one of history's greatest ironies, that Tlatoani Moctezuma, the speaker for the Mexica, found himself outmaneuvered by a slave woman translator whose own voice has been lost to history. The contradictions of gender, indigenous identity, and the fracturing power system of the Mexica all conspired against each other to produce one of the Spanish-Aztec War's most influential and enigmatic figures, Malintzin. But Malintzin herself forms an empty center in the story, a void left behind which has been filled with narratives that cast her as savior or traitor and everything in between across the centuries. The cliché goes that the silence was deafening, but in our case, in this episode, silence is just that, silence, a historical hole that obliterates memory and leaves its history open to pure conjecture. Let us listen for whatever historical echoes are in that silence in this week's episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast where history isn't a story repeating, but a conspiracy unraveling. Episode 1.8, Malintzin, the Silent Interpreter. When she was young, the girl would have been called something like daughter-child. Some girls in her world earned funny, affectionate names, like She's Not a Fish, or Little Old Woman, or poetic ones, like Deerflower. But most were simply called elder daughter, middle child, or youngest, at least until their personalities became better known. Living at the fringes of empire, this daughter-child held no illusions about the agonies of war. She harbored no belief that it was for a greater good. It was simply the way things were. If she allowed herself to have any feelings about the Mexica at all, her sentiment was hatred. So writes historian Camilla Townsend of the woman we now know today as La Malinche. When we first met her, she was one of the 20 women slaves given over to Cortez as a result of his victory at Pontonchan. She made her first mark on history further up the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, as the Spanish encountered the first Nahua. As these Nahua came upon the Cortesista expedition, they spoke in the language that Geronimo de Aguilar, the Spanish Yucatec Maya-speaking castaway, rescued by his fellow Christians, could not translate. Cortez raged at his now useless translator. The luck of discovering Aguilar seemed to have run out just as it was becoming crucial. But in that moment, luck renewed itself for Cortez. A Nahua woman in their expedition, who had been gifted to Portocarrero by Cortez, stepped forward and in Maya told Aguilar that she understood what the man was saying as he was speaking in her native tongue. The language was Nahuatl, and not only could the woman speak it, she could do so in the high register of its nobility. Cortez now found himself not only in command of a chain of translation to speak to the people of Mexico, but in command of a tongue that could speak the dialect of its kings. It is one of those moments of blind, stupid luck that so often determines the course of historical events when seized, and Cortez seized it. He took back the gift of this woman from Portocarrero and kept her at his side without exception for the next several years. She would become Cortez's voice. To many of the indigenous she communicated with, she would be regarded as inseparable from Cortez himself. But little is known about this woman from the perspective of historical fact. What can be said for sure is that she was born to a noble Nahua family in the region of Coatzacoalcos, nearby the modern-day Veracruz. Bernal Diaz, the foot soldier who would later recount his time in the conquest in his memoir, relates the story of Malintzin, who he called Doña Marina, as such. Her mother and father were lords and caciques of a town called Painela, which had other towns subject to it, and lay about 24 miles from the town of Coatzacoalcos. Her father died while she was still very young, and her mother married another cacique, a young man, to whom she bore a son. The mother and father seem to have been very fond of this son, for they agreed that he should succeed to the caciqueship when they were dead. To avoid any impediment, they gave Doña Marina to some Indians from Xicalango, and this they did by night in order to be unobserved. They then spread the report that the child had died, and as the daughter of one of their Indian slaves happened to die at this time, they gave it out that this was the daughter, the heiress. The Indians of Xicalango gave the child to the people of Tabasco, and the Tabascans gave her to Cortez. Once again, we find a nice story, but unlikely history. Rules of inheritance would not have made Malintzin a threat to any son. Whether or not Diaz misremembered her story, misinterpreted, or simply believed a convenient lie that Malintzin told herself is unknown. What more likely happened is that when she was born in the Nawa tradition, the umbilical cord that had connected her to her mother was buried by the hearth of the home, and a prayer was given, which went, "You will be the heart of the home. You will go nowhere. You will not become a wanderer anywhere. You will become the banked fire, the hearthstones." As a Nawa woman, her role would have been confined near entirely to the home of her family. Perhaps, if her Altepet had one, she would have gone to the Kalmekek, or schools for nobles, and received a standard education in the songs and traditions of the Aztec Empire. These schools, if you will remember, were as open to boys as they were girls. After that, she would give birth, grind maize into tortillas, and weave clothing. Nothing more, even as a noblewoman, utterly anonymous in the historical record. But that was not what happened. What we know instead is that at some point, for uncertain reasons, she was sold as a young girl slave to Maya traders from Tabasco, who brought her back eastward to do the work of a slave woman in their household. Like Aguilar, she learned her Yucatec Maya from the position of a slave and spoke it like one. But given that she had been offered by the chief of Potonchan as one of the 20 women given as tribute to the Spanish, it is likely that she was a slave in a noble household, perhaps even a treasured one. Her age is unknown, but she was young when the Spanish inherited her enslavement, somewhere between 16 and 19, without a home or roots and at the mercy of her new captors. The other 19 women given to the Spaniards were doled out among them like prizes. Malintzin would have watched along with the others as they were sprinkled in the unusual water held by the foreign priests in a ritual they could not understand. She would have listened as each of them were given new names before they were systematically raped. Afterward, some of them would have been given to particular conquistadores, but none of them was to be spared the hardships of sexual enslavement. This might have been the rest of her life had it not been for one moment of opportunity to seize upon. As the Spanish party came upon the shores of Tabasco and tried and failed to communicate to the Nahuatl-speaking men there, Malintzin saw her moment and spoke up. In doing so, she used her language to vault her from the anonymity of just another slave girl to become the original translator of the Spanish-Aztec War, the tongue of two worlds. It is impossible to overstate her influence over the events that were to follow, and it is equally impossible to say exactly what that influence was. Hardly a single word of her own was recorded in history, though her place in it we can be certain of from both indigenous and Spanish sources. Cortés, in his infamous Cartas de Relación, would only make a few references to her at all, and named her just once across tens of thousands of self-inflating words. Cortés' style was such that he seemed to imply to Emperor Charles V that he had spoken to all these indigenous directly and through sheer initiative made himself understood in the Castilian dialect of Spanish known at the time. Bernal Diaz, far more sympathetic to Doña Marina as he called her, wrote of her as a beautiful woman of indispensable value to the Spanish, and more than once wrote of her bravery in the events that were to follow. But even among all of his laudatory and rambling prose, there isn't a single quotation directly attributed to her. Later, the mestizo historian of half Tlaxcalan ancestry, Diego Muñoz Camargo, would compile his famous History of Tlaxcala to support the idea that his people had been among the earliest supporters of the Spaniards' holy mission in the Nahua world. He would illustrate the woman at Cortés's side throughout the entire saga of alliance, drawing glyphs from her mouth, and not Cortés's, that indicated important speech, but again quoting nothing specific. If Moctezuma's shadows were cast by the light of contradictory historical illuminations, this woman is instead an indecipherable whisper told just below volume. Her historical voice set to a frequency we can perceive but not hear, and it leaves behind an eerie silence, one that leaves us straining to hear anything at all, and, in doing so, hallucinates a voice which speaks back to us in the register of our own biases and historical wish fulfillment. A slave in life, she became in her death a slave of history. Even the name she called herself is unknown to us. As she was seized by the Spanish, Father Olmedo led the baptisms which erased their names and replaced them with Christian ones, a first act of translation that shows how the process can be used to obscure as much as it reveals. In colonization, a name is the first thing stolen. She was baptized as Marina, but the Nahuatl-speaking people had no R sound of their own, saying it first as Malina. As her importance in the events she interpreted grew, both the Spanish and the Nahuatl gave her titles. The Spanish added Doña to her name, while the Nahuatl added the suffix Tzin, Tzin, rendering her name Malintzin, which the Spanish reinterpreted as Malinche. Just from the back and forth of naming this woman, we can see the way in which interpretation drifts between languages and cultures. What else could have been lost or assumed through the interpreter? Despite their importance, we have no way of knowing how faithful her translations ever really were. Aguilar, who would be the only Spaniard on record unimpressed by her, always maintained his suspicion of her translations. Whatever she did or did not do, it was evidently enough to satisfy Cortez's ambitions and gave him a head start on the power of translation. Later, the Nahuatl would be quick to learn Spanish, and some Spaniards would take the time to learn Nahuatl, including Bernal Diaz, who had also learned Taíno while in the Caribbean. But for the moment, Malintzin was the only link between Cortez and the world he wished to conquer. And it's by the side of Cortez we return to now. When we last saw them, the Spaniards were finishing their touches on the town of Veracruz and established the first Spanish settlement in Mesoamerica. As we saw in episode 1.6, no sooner had the Spanish made landfall on the Gulf Coast of Mexico that Tentlil, the Mexica diplomat, arrived to greet them, offer tribute, and glean whatever information he could about their plans. Malintzin would have understood that the immediacy of this diplomat's arrival spoke to the network of spies, messengers, and bureaucrats that the Aztecs maintained control over within their empire. Far from landing as soon-to-be conquerors, the Spanish were immediately swept back up into the power politics of the Aztec Empire, tearing itself apart at the seams. The Spanish were to ultimately spend 4 months on this beach in their town of Veracruz. What delayed them considerably at first was constant infighting. The Blasquista faction may have been defeated, but had not been eliminated. The Spanish may have founded Veracruz, but they had not yet built it. They tried elaborating on the huts constructed for them by their Mexica servants, gifted by Tentlil, but found it difficult to construct anything on this mosquito-ridden coast where the constant biting of insects and sweating under the hot and humid conditions of the Gulf drove them mad. They were at the mercy of the elements, and also, unsure of their surroundings, were vulnerable to the initiatives of indigenous leaders who wished to use their presence to their own advantage. Malintzin, if she was as perceptive as she must have been to survive these brutal years, would have observed all of these divisions between the Spanish sharply. She was said to have had long discussions with Aguilar, in which she learned the history of the Spanish, their Caribbean empire, and the ambitions they brought with them to Old Mexico. Over these first few months, she became America's foremost expert in its nascent colonizers. It was at this time that the Totonacs of Cempoala came into the story. Having first been approached by the Grijalva expedition, they saw the Spanish in the same way Moctezuma did, as a challenge to the existing order, and maybe the point at which leverage could be applied against the Aztecs. The departure of Grijalva had aggrieved them deeply, and the return of a second expedition to their shores seemed nothing short of a miracle. Their arrival became Malintzin's first major opportunity to fulfill her role. The Totonac messengers came upon the Cordacista expedition wishing to extend an invitation to their Altepet on behalf of their Tlatoani. The messengers excused his absence from the welcoming party, as Malintzin translated, by saying the chief was simply too fat to come down himself. The Spanish imagined that any chief who ruled over a kingdom that could allow him to become so fat must be prosperous. Malintzin could not speak Totonac, and so another translator was included who could speak Nahuatl and Totonac. Then Malintzin would in turn turn that Nahuatl into Yucatec Maya, and finally Aguilar would turn that Yucatec into Spanish. This triple-linked chain of translated conversation was cumbersome and irritating to Cortez, who vacillated between extreme patience and flashes of rage at the process. But in it, Malintzin experienced her first taste of power. As Aguilar and the other Spanish waited upon her translation, she understood the power to shape the reality around her. It was a lesson she was eager to learn. The Totonacs invited the Spanish to their home. The Spaniards accepted the invitation, abandoning their attempt at building Veracruz at this first site in the process. The town would continue to exist as a legal fiction, but nothing of its original settlement would last. they would refound it somewhere else when convenient to do so. And so they carried the town and documents in their pockets as the Spaniards and their Taíno, African, Mexica, and Totonac servants, slaves, and allies made the march north to Cempoala to meet this fat chief. The translators remained at Cortez's side at all times. The Spaniards moved up north along the coast, making it to just outside the town of Cempoala on the first day. They were all fed by the Totonacs as they arrived, a sign of their welcome. Malintzin told Aguilar that they were expected inside the city by the Tlatoani himself. Cortez sent some horsemen ahead. The Totonacs were fascinated by this combination of man and beast. The Spanish horsemen, for their part, got equally lost in the illusions. The evening light reflected off the whitewashed paint of the Cempoalan buildings in such a way that they hurried back to Cortez to tell him that they were about to find an entire city constructed of silver. But of course they did not find such silver homes there, and were instead greeted by the Cempoalans who played their conch shells in such a way that it reminded the Spanish of the fanfare of trumpets. They saw orchards and gardens and fields of maize that spoke to the fertility of the region, and were greeted in the center of the city itself by the Tlatoani, carried there by his servants. He was indeed enormous, and Malintzin explained to Aguilar that his name was Tlacochcalcat. In another act of practical translation, the Spanish were unable to pronounce this name and instead called him the Fat Chief. The Spanish and the Cempoalans, through the efforts of the Totonac translator, Malintzin, and Aguilar, began to have a slow, halting conversation that nevertheless proved fruitful for both. Cortez presented himself as the leader of a pacifying mission of peace, sent to overthrow tyrannies in the name of Emperor Charles V, and to bring about the one true faith and rescue these people from their pagan ways. The fat chief listened politely and heard only what he wanted to hear, that these strangers were here on a mission of violence, a violence that he hoped to direct himself. He showered Cortez with details about the conditions of this empire. The Aztec were powerful, he said. Their fortress of a city, Tenochtitlan, was built on an island in the middle of an enormous lake and was said to be impenetrable. He complained bitterly about the tribute burden of the Mexica on their subjugated Altepeme, and especially the tribute levied on Cempoala. He insisted to Cortez that not only were the Cempoalans unhappy, but a prince by the name of Ixtlilxochitl in the region of Texcoco had recently fought a civil war against his brother to a standstill and hated the Mexica for their part in the conflict. There was also Tlaxcala, not too far to the west, which had never been conquered by the Mexica and stood as their most bitter enemies. The fat chief suggested an alliance and offered hundreds of his own warriors and servants to the Spanish. Cortez and his captains believed they had struck diplomatic gold and immediately conspired on how best to use this information. They now believed themselves to have lucked into a civil crisis within the empire that they could now exploit. With the help of the Cempoalans, and possibly these Tlaxcalans and Texcocans they had learned about, they might be able to leverage multiple armies to penetrate the impenetrable city of Tenochtitlan. All of this information would pass through Malintzin, who internalized every word. She knew that her interpretation was key to the Spanish success. She was aware of Tlaxcala's bitter rivalry with the Mexica, and she also knew that the Tlaxcalans were as prideful as any Mexica, and that the path to an alliance with them would be more dangerous than the Spanish realized. And this danger would be compounded, as it always is, by the ignorance of such danger even existing. It was a classic case of the Spanish misreading the situation they were in. They believed themselves to have strong-armed the local cacique into paying tribute to them and accepting their vassal status to the emperor across the sea, complete with an army furnished to them for that exact purpose. What they did not yet realize was that those soldiers doubled as Cempoalan spies, who would watch the Spanish and track their success and report back to the fat chief whether the Spanish were winning or losing, allowing the Tlatoani to make a later decision about which side to commit to in the conflict that he was stirring up. If, in exchange, the fat chief had to accept Cempoala being a vassal to a faraway king so distant as to be imaginary, so be it. It was only a rhetorical reality, not a political one, and the vassalage to Moctezuma was more pressing and more dangerous. If Malintzin was aware of any of this, it was because it was another version of the same game she was playing. Throw in your lot with these powerful strangers and see what comes of it. A different decision could always be made later. Cortez overplayed his hand, however. Upon seeing some slaves of the Sempawalans set aside for sacrifice, he ordered them released. The fat chief was aghast at this decision, crying out that the Spanish would ruin him by releasing their slaves selected for sacrifice to the gods. Cortés began to give his usual speech of conversion, but was stopped by Father Olmedo, who, in an act of pragmatic restraint, warned Cortés that now may not be the best time to upset their new friends by forcing them to abandon their gods. The fat chief knew that the Spanish were attempting to found a settlement again, having been aware of their first attempt at Veracruz further south. He informed them that they should continue north to an altepet known as Cuyahuitzlan, where there was a river that may be of interest to them. The Spanish set out the next day, reaching the site and being greeted once again by another Tlatoani, who perfumed the stinking, sweating Spanish with incense in a ceremony the Spaniards had become accustomed to. Malintzin began translating again for the Spanish by saying that this Tlatoani had similar complaints about the Mexica tax collectors. And it is at this point it just so happened that these collectors were arriving into town, and the Spanish watched as these Mexica walked past them without stopping to address or even notice them, already aware of their existence and determined not to be seen as put off by it. They went straight to the Tlatoani of Cuyahuitzlan to collect what they believed was owed. But the Spanish had other plans. Cortés explained to Aguilar and Malintzin to order that the Tlatoani arrest these Mexica rather than host them, and that their actions would be backed by the might of the Spanish army. The Tlatoani was flabbergasted by this suggestion, but saw an opportunity as it was presented to him and seized the men, arresting them. Cortés then conducted a diplomatic sleight of hand made possible by his translator. In the words of Hugh Thomas, during the night, Cortés carried out a devious trick. He ordered his guards secretly to release 2 of the stewards and bring them to him. He then required Aguilar and Malintzin to pretend to try and find out who they were. They declared themselves to be Mexican stewards. They added that they were surprised to have been treated as such. Usually they were well looked after. They thought that the Castilians must have encouraged the people of Cuyahuitzlan to act so unwisely as to arrest them. They also feared lest their companions, the other collectors, might be put to death before Moctezuma could be told of their plight, for the local people were barbarous. The stewards added that these people of the coast would rise against Moctezuma if they had a chance, a thing that would infuriate the emperor and give him the expense and trouble of suppressing them. Cortés told the officials that he had freed them because he did not like to think of Moctezuma's agents being mistreated. He personally liked what he had heard of Moctezuma. He would be grateful if they could kindly go and tell the emperor that he, Cortés, considered Moctezuma his friend. He hoped that Moctezuma would not spurn his friendship, as Tentlil, as he thought, had foolishly done. He believed that Moctezuma would be happy to see him, and become a brother of the King of Castile. Finally, he would do what he could to prevent the other collectors of tribute from being killed. Thereupon he released the 2 men. He had them carried in the darkness by sailors in a small boat up the coast to a point outside Totonac territory. Thence they returned to Tenochtitlan as fast as they could. The Tlatoani of Cuyahuitzlan was furious when he discovered this and threatened to execute the remaining officials. Cortés talked him out of it. By now, some of his fleet had caught up to them on the coast. The Spanish sent the Mexica prisoners to the ship and out of the hands of the Tlatoani, later freeing them once again with apologies. Cortés tried to extend the conversation he had had with the fat chief to the people of Cuyahuitzlan through Malintzin, that they should consider an alliance with the Spanish. The Tlatoani considered this proposal and agreed to go into rebellion against Tenochtitlan if the Spanish would guarantee his safety. Finding success in their grasp, the Spanish agreed to a nearby site to refound the town of Veracruz. Their fleet rejoined them there and anchored just off the coast. The Spanish now had what looked like a plausible way forward. No longer stranded on the mosquito-ridden coast, they had been gifted hundreds of Totonac porters and warriors to assist them. Plans for a rebellion had been made and agreed with by 2 Tlatoque, with rumors of further Altepeme that may join them. It was now at this point that the Spanish were determined to march on Tenochtitlan, a goal they intended to achieve either through the tongue of Malintzin or by the blade of Spanish steel. But it just so happened at this time that another Mexica delegation came upon the Spanish. Just as with Tentlil, they came bearing gifts and news that Moctezuma had learned of the freeing of his imprisoned tax collectors and wanted to thank the Spanish for their efforts that excused, it was explained, their residing with a people as barbarous as the Sempawalans. They also returned the helmet that Cortez had given Tentlil, filled with gold dust as requested. Once again, Cortez demanded Malintzin ask about the Spanish arriving in Tenochtitlan, and once again he was rebuffed, this time by two nephews of Moctezuma himself, who made the usual excuses and warned them that these tributes came with the strict condition that they were to press no further. With that, they wished the Spanish luck with their new town and retreated. Cortez and the Spanish were elated at the news and officially refounded Veracruz on the 28th of June, 1519, 2 months after their first attempt. They were further reinforced by ships sent from Cuba at the behest of Montejo and Portocarrero, which contained much-needed supplies and men. The Spanish were now an army hundreds strong between themselves and their Totonac allies. And Cortez sought to test his new strength. He returned to Zempoala and demanded, through Malintzin, an audience with the fat chief. He insisted that if they were to make an alliance, they could only do so if the Zempoalans abandoned their false gods and smashed their idols. The fat chief again refused, but Cortez pushed through and ordered their destruction anyway. It was said that, when the chiefs and the people saw their idols broken and lying on the ground, they set up a miserable howl, covered their faces, and begged forgiveness of the idols that were unable to protect them. It was not the last act of zealotry that the Spanish would display. Whatever Malintzin thought of these actions, she kept to herself, a habit maintained from her days as a slave of the Maya. The decision is made, though not everyone is invited to make it. The expedition would not return to Cuba and would not settle for settlement. It is to be a mission of conquest. Malintzin watches Cortez as he argues with the other Spanish. He is relentless, talking inexhaustibly until he wears down the opposition. They relent, if only to get on with it. Unable to understand what he is saying, she speaks to the only man among them she can talk to, Geronimo de Aguilar. She asks what is happening. Aguilar explains that they are to march on Tenochtitlan, and that they would do so with the assistance of these people called Tlaxcalteca. The plan is stupefying to Malintzin, as she believes that these men, for all of their mysterious power, have no understanding of what they are committing to. And she can't help but notice, from even behind the veil of the Spanish language she does not understand, that not all of these men seem to agree with the one who calls himself their speaker. She knows the Tlaxcalteca well. Coatzacoalcos had been one of the few regions remaining that still traded with them after the Mexica embargo. She knows that these people are proud and vicious warriors whose hatred for the Mexica goes so far beyond the scope of the mission these strangers articulated that they will soon find themselves silenced by the tip of the Tlaxcalteca spear. What possesses these men, she wonders? What drives them forward? They speak of a god, but only one, and Malintzin wonders if that is because all others have abandoned these men in their foolishness. They speak of a king far away across the edge of the world, but can these men be motivated to fight for a man as illusory as the home these men claim to come from? All she can tell is that these men know of only two currencies of persuasion, violence and gold. They rule by the former and are ruled by the latter, and it is now the violence that the speaker resorts to. His great water houses, these ships they speak so much about, are brought to the sandy beach of the Totonac shore. Malintzin, uncomprehending of so much, understands what is meant as the speaker takes a torch to the ship, then another, and burns each to the sea level, the inferno reflecting in her eyes. Wherever these men have come from, she thinks, they will not return. They have chained themselves to a lodestone with which they must now all pull. Malintzin, feeling the yoke of the slave, knows she will have to pull with them. Myth is the translation of events into history. Though it inevitably distorts it, the telling of what happened is impossible without myth. And it is at this point that one of the great myths of the Spanish conquest of Mexico, told in its traditional form, comes into play. It is said that upon the decision to march on Tenochtitlan, Cortez beached his fleet and set fire to the brigantines and the naos in a moment of heroic determinism. They would conquer Tenochtitlan or die trying, but they would never go back. But this is an image wholly invented, and, in the hagiography of the conquest, one of the key points at which the story begins to lie to itself, a product of the drift of truth in the translation of history from one era to the next. Neither Cortés in his Cartas de Relación nor Diaz in his True History ever mention a burning of the ships, nor does Andrés de Tapia in his own brief written recollections of the conquest. All of them agree that some of the ships were dismantled or sunk, differing only slightly on the number of ships involved. It is only in 1546, in a history of the conquest written by a Spanish historian, that the myth of the boat burning is written into history through a mistranslation of a Spanish verb. It's an image too good to be true, Cortés's own crossing of the Rubicon, but it only becomes audible as the result of a language gap. Instead, this burning of the ships was a moment of collective decision-making among the captains of the expedition that Cortés sees credit for, as with so much else. The reality is, as historian Matthew Restall puts it, the remaining ships had been at sea for 6 months without access to a full array of supplies for maintenance and repair. Their wooden hulls were beginning to rot. The myth history of this incident shows the wear of so many hands gripping it and pulling and manipulating it to fit an image of history. It is emblematic of the Cortesista myth, the one which says that Cortés did this and Cortés did that Bernal Diaz complains so bitterly about in his own memoirs. Decisions made by the collective are tossed aside for the greater glory of Cortés, a phenomenon that Malintzin herself would experience as a reward for her own efforts. So why did she do all this? Why step forward to offer to translate for these men? It is a question that was not thought of nearly at all, at least by the Spanish and their descendants in Mexico throughout the colonial era. In the immediate history of the conquest, she was almost entirely forgotten, a footnote to Cortés. As the decades went on into centuries, her role was revived, and she was seen as something of a colonial hero to the Spanish regime in New Spain. She was seen as simply the Indian who had saved the Spanish, and she would be beloved for her role. Later, in her own life, she was to have a son by Cortés, named Martín after Cortés's father, and so Malintzin would be seen as a kind of Mexican Eve who gave birth to the mestizo race of Mexicans. This would not endear her in Mexican history after independence from Spain, where her role was seen even closer to being identified with Eve through her treachery. She had betrayed her own people by throwing her lot in with the Spanish, and her memory was scorned. Somewhere between the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s and the sexual revolution of the 1970s, her role once again began to be examined as the ultimate victim of Spanish cruelty and backward indigenous gender norms. She was a symbol of the rape of Mexico and spoken of defensively. Today, her reputation is as complicated as ever. She has been examined and re-examined. Her story has again evolved, giving her a new agency, neither collaborator nor victim, but simply a young girl trying to survive a violent and unstable world. The question posed by historians today is, if you were in her position and had the choice to save yourself, wouldn't you? Let's examine all three of these perspectives of the historical Malintzin as best we can, and use it as a way of understanding not only the gender politics of Mexico, but the entire concept of indigenous identity at the time of the Spanish invasion. First, there is Malintzin the accomplice, the woman who betrayed her entire race. This version of Malintzin betrays the cultural anxiety over the process of mestizaje, or the mixing of races that defines the history of Mexico. In this version of the story, La Malinche is a woman who throws her lot in with the conquerors, and in doing so climbs up a ladder that she later pulls up behind her, and dooms an empire in the process. There are a number of angles to interpret and correct this interpretation with. The first being the assumption that, at the time of the Spanish invasion, there was anything like a concept of shared racial identity among the indigenous people of the Americas. There simply wasn't. It is difficult to conceive of an us without a them. For thousands of years, the differences in people in the Americas was not of race but ethnicity, which tribe or altepet or kin network they belonged to. The Tenochca Mexica of Tenochtitlan could hardly stand the Tlahtolocan Mexica next door, and thought even less of the Chalca that came from Chalco to the southeast. As we saw in episode 1.5 of Ixtlilxochitl, even brothers from the same family would go to war with one another when the occasion demanded it. When Moctezuma, receiving reports of the Spanish advance in his palace at Tenochtitlan, heard of this woman, his messengers struggled to find the vocabulary to describe her. She was not one of the Spanish, they said, but one of us people here. perhaps the first such instance in the Aztec Empire of these opposing identities of indigenous and colonizers being said out loud. But even the conquistadores came short of a pan-Spanish identity, let alone a pan-European one. They were collectively Castilians, except for those who weren't. Cortés, as a rule, favored the extremeños of his expedition, men like Alvarado, Sandoval, and Portocarrero, all hailing from the same region of Castile that Cortés himself did. The Granadians, Aragonese, and other realms of the recently remade Spain were barely countrymen, to say nothing of the odd Frenchmen or Genoese in the Cortesista expedition. The concept of race as we understand it today simply did not exist in the year 1519, though it was beginning to formulate as Spaniards argued in courts of the king and among each other of what to do with all these Indians, as they called them, painting them in one broad stroke. So it is hard to hold Malintzin accountable to betraying the indigenous race that did not yet exist. The concept would have been baffling to her, a Nahua from Coatzacoalcos, that she owed anything to the Mexica the Spaniards were so clearly after. Decades of imperial expansion and subjugation had left much of the empire with a deep historical hatred of the Mexica and their tyrannical Tlatoque and burdensome tributes. Even the very alliance that held together the empire was under strain, as Ixtlilxochit's civil war against his Tlatoani brother Cacama had rendered Texcoco, the second most important city of the empire, into its own triple division. A pan-indigenous identity would eventually form in Mexico with the casta racial system the people of New Spain adhered to fanatically. But even then, it would develop unevenly, slipping in and out of view like something substantial hidden behind a great fog that has lingered over Mexico for 500 years after the conquest. Malintzin absolutely threw her lot in with the Spanish. What conflict she felt about this, if any, we'll never know. But we can say for certainty that she was not alone. As we will see, Malintzin was hardly the last indigenous collaborator with the Spanish. Thousands of naturales, as the Spanish called them, would ally with the Spanish when it became apparent that doing so was their best possible way of coming out on top of the dog pile that was the Aztec Civil War. None of these other indigenous groups, the Totonacs, the Tlaxcalans, the Texcocans, among many others, have ever been interrogated as deeply for their complicity in the conquest as Malintzin. And to interject my own personal opinion as to why this is, I feel there are two main reasons. The first is obvious. Malintzin was a young woman making a difficult choice, and history is so often unkind to such women. Enormous gender and racial anxieties exist around the idea of Malintzin not only aiding the Spanish, but giving birth to their sons. Despite the obvious lack of consent involved with this arrangement, Malintzin, the mother of the mestizos, is also known as one of La Chingada, a product of a system of rape that has defined Mexican national identity in complicated ways. To this day, political accusations of being a Malinchista carry a heavy weight to them. The second reason is less obvious, but still easy enough to understand. It is easier to hold an individual accountable for history's crimes than it is a collective. While the other groups of indigenous allied with the Spanish by the thousands, most of them did so with the shield of historical anonymity, save for a few dozen. How can history render a sentence of group punishment? It's much easier to hold one person up as a symbol of all history rather than as one history herself and say Malintzin is this or Malintzin is that. So if Malintzin is an accomplice, she is no more so than thousands of others. All of these people did so with their own goals in mind. Many of them did not live to see those goals fulfilled. It is a difficult enough task for us to describe the conquest of Mexico beyond its historical hallucinations. So how could we pass judgment onto those who lived through this history psychologically? The image of Malintzin began to be reconsidered again in the 1970s by Mexican feminists who sought to interrogate the image of Malintzin the accomplice and consider much of what we just discussed. What did she owe, and to whom? The Mexica who subjugated her people? The family who sold her into slavery? The Maya who gifted her to the Spanish? As Townsend writes in her fabulous book Malintzin's Choices, the closest thing we will ever have to a biography on the woman, what should she have done when she was given into the hands of armed Spanish men? Would her critics seriously recommend suicide as an affirmation of herself and her people? We should acknowledge that she was a victim more than once. There are advantages and disadvantages to this interpretation, which still collectively fail to capture the complexity of her situation. Malintzin was a slave twice over, first to the Maya and then to the Spanish. But slavery is one word which describes a range of conditions known throughout history. The slavery conducted by Mesoamericans between each other was not the slavery conducted by the Spaniards against the Mesoamericans or their imported West Africans. As a slave in the Maya household, Malintzin would have likely experienced some forms of basic kindness from her masters in the interest of keeping domestic harmony. Her children, if she had any, would not inherit her status. Emancipation of slaves was always a possibility, and servitude often did end, though just as often ending in the Aztec world by being sacrificed at the altar. But Malintzin would have also learned to bite her tongue and speak only in agreement with her masters, keeping whatever she felt about her situation to herself. As Townsend explains, her exploitation would have been beyond the responsibilities of maintaining the woman's sphere of the Maya household. As she writes, it is also likely that Malintzin first came to be used sexually in this period. Whether she felt forced or not was probably a complicated question. In Townsend's words, the tradition of Nahuatl songs about female slaves gave voice to a range of feelings, from those who tried to establish warm and erotic relationships with their masters out of love or self-preservation, and those who railed against the feeling of being violated and dispossessed, often alternating between the two in the same song. Being a slave woman was a bitter fate for the women of Mesoamerica, not only because of the violence they experienced, sexual, physical, or otherwise, but because they lost the status afforded to free women in the Nahuatl-speaking world, where women were highly regarded, though segregated in daily life, as mothers and keepers of the household, both in its present and, through childbirth, its future. A captive woman could still have children, Tlatoani Itzcoatl was one such, but they would not be carrying on the legacy of their slave mothers, but of their free fathers. The captured woman had no family to inherit the family legacy, which would die with her in enslavement. None of this would be needed to explain to Malintzin, who was intimately aware of the realities of being a slave. When the Spanish came and she was given as one of 20 women to these strange men, she likely would have experienced that, despite the differences between the Maya and the Spanish masters, her life continued on being mostly the same. And at first, it did. After her baptism as Marina, she was given, as we know, to Portocarrero by Cortés himself as a gift. Said to have been the most beautiful of the women given by the Maya, Cortés wanted to curry favor with the highest-ranking nobleman of his expedition. And so Marina found herself being used once again as an object of status. But there is a third perspective to take on Malintzin, that she was neither demon nor saint, neither Eve nor Joan of Arc. She was simply a young woman who saw an opportunity to make herself useful beyond what she had ever conceived for herself. When she learned that one of her new captors spoke Yucatec Maya but struggled to speak Nahuatl when necessary, she knew her skills would allow her to leverage herself immediately to make the best of a bad situation. And she had to act fast, for as Townsend writes, without her help at certain points, Cortés would have almost certainly died or been forced to turn back. But it seems equally sure that had she not existed, some other Spaniard on some other expedition would have come across another woman much like Malinche, for she was a typical product of the Mesoamerican world as it then was. So Malintzin did what she did not as an accomplice nor as a victim, but as someone who tried to exercise as much control over her own life as possible. And it was a gambit that paid off immediately. Upon learning of her abilities, Cortés pulled her aside and said to her, through Aguilar, that if she were to help him accomplish his goals using her skills, he would reward her with more than her liberty, which he meant as a way of hinting at the riches he wished to secure for himself and his expedition. The same promise he enticed everyone with along the way. As she became accustomed to her new role, she would have found ample time to converse with the one Spaniard she could speak to directly. Through Geronimo de Aguilar, she learned that the sea that surrounded their world was not boundless after all. It was larger than she could imagine, but within about 10 weeks sailing toward the rising sun, there lay a land full of people who worshipped a powerful god of their own. They called themselves Cristianos, among many other names. In any case, explained Geronimo de Aguilar, his people were one group among many who worshipped this same god. He himself was, he said, a Spaniard, and it was the Spaniards who had first discovered this part of the earth, this new world, and conquered and settled the great islands that lay a few days to the east of the Caribbean Sea. At first, the Spaniards thought they had reached the islands off the coast of a place called Asia, such as the famed Cipangu, or Japan, or perhaps India. The explorer, called Columbus, was so convinced of this that he had named the people he met Indians, and the name stuck. After more than 10 years, the newcomers had acknowledged that what they had found was not Asia, but a landmass hitherto unimagined by anyone. They sent out many exploratory expeditions from the Caribbean and kidnapped a number of interpreters. They thought they had learned that on this mainland there was a rich nation somewhere to the west. It was important that they find it, Aguilar added, for there were now about 5,000 Spaniards living in the Caribbean, and there was simply not enough wealth for all of them. So writes Camilla Townsend. Through this, she would become one of the best informed people of the two worlds now intersecting and would leverage this knowledge not only to her own advantage. She was a woman who found herself of great importance outside the home and hearth that Nahua women were traditionally afforded. When indigenous men like Tentlil, the Mexica diplomat who met the Spaniards in Totonac country, spoke to Cortez, he was met with a response by Malintzin, and would have been dumbstruck to have seen a woman in such position of authority. She would also see up close how devastating the effects of the Spanish technological advantage could be against native weaponry. She would have seen the way that Spanish steel destroyed the macuawit of the Aztecs, that wooden paddle laced with razor-sharp but brittle obsidian. She would have also seen as how little as 3 horsemen could trample an entire division of indigenous warriors unprepared to deal with the giant fighting beasts. She would have watched and learned silence as particularly unlucky Nahua were torn apart by Spanish dogs. All of this left a deep impression on her, and it has been suggested that in her Nahuatl translation of Spanish commands, she would make impassioned pleas for the people of the Altepet to surrender now and survive rather than resist and be annihilated. But she was not playing at being a savior to these people by doing so. Malintzin had a vested interest in the Spanish success from the moment that Cortez appointed her his official tongue, and the two would become so intertwined in the diplomacy of the Spanish during the wars to come that the indigenous would address even Cortez as Malintzin, a fact which irked him to no end. Cortez would prove to be a difficult man to navigate, and he would rage in jealousy at anyone who came too close to the woman he hoarded like a dragon hoards treasure. He was especially suspicious of Aguilar, the only man who could at first converse with her directly. This particular animus directed at him by Cortez may explain why, of all the conquistadores, Aguilar is the only one who failed to be charmed by the woman herself, speaking bitterly of her in his later years, at the liberty she took in translations, and how she had made him redundant in Cortez's plans by learning Spanish faster than anyone expected. Whatever perspective you choose to take when examining the historical Malintzin, it is impossible to separate the story of this Nahua woman from the Spanish man. As so often, history presents a persuasive case and then comes to a dissatisfying judgment. Nowhere is this more apparent than with Malintzin. With the Spanish committed to the march on Tenochtitlan, so was Malintzin. She walked alongside Cortez and Aguilar and all the rest of the Spaniards, barefoot in the tradition of slaves and commoners, with the surface of the world she had resided in crumbling beneath her feet with every step. She was a young woman who had, through sheer circumstance, become the voice that built a bridge she had never asked to build between the two empires she spoke for, but to which neither she belonged. The Spanish needed her and the indigenous trusted her, but each, in their own way, would betray her. Translation is not a neutral bridge. It's an act of power, erasure, invention, or weapon. Malintzin's silence is not an absence. It is absence that is evidence of who wrote the story for her. The conquest was not merely a conflict. It was a conversation, a mangled, misinterpreted one that proved impossible to stop once it began. And Malintzin was now the voice in the middle, carrying a weapon that was more powerful than steel or horses or cannon. She was neither accomplice nor victim nor savior. She was just another prisoner, and one of the conflict's few survivors, but a survivor who, despite her interpretive importance, did not get the opportunity to tell her own tale. And so now we are left listening to our own voices echo back to us in the cavern of historical emptiness, left behind by her own absence, hearing only the tale we tell ourselves and wish to hear of her. It is a bitter fate for history's most important but unrecorded voice. And it's a voice we will have to leave here, as next week we will turn back to the Spanish and follow the two diplomats who left the Cortesista expedition to return to their home country, Francisco Montejo and Alonso Fernandez de Portocarrero, each of whom carried with them the documents that spoke of the happy fiction of a legal coup in the New World, and the treasure they would use to bribe the crown into believing. But that's all to come next week. And so that's all for this episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On. Written, narrated, and produced by Gavrilo Z, with music composed and performed by Jake Kraseniak. If you like the show, tell your friends. All my listeners are appreciated. Goodbye.